Welcome to the dice game. We're going to be showing you how you can output HTML elements and output the HTML character for the dice, and then set a dynamic number of players. So if you wanted to have 12 players and do a roll for all of the players, it will show the die as well as the player and then the value that they scored on the roll and highlight the ones in green, which are the winners. So you can update this to whatever number of players you want. You can have a whole bunch of players, like in this case we've got 24 players, and then there's the 2 winners there out of that roll. And if the more you can continue to roll and generate another set of players and their gameplay, and then you can also bring it down if you only want like 4 players, you can do that as well. So once again, the format is set there. You can also customize the output format as needed. And this is going to be some JavaScript, creating page elements, selecting page elements, a little bit of game logic, and then how you can output that visually to the player. So that's all coming up. Set up an HTML file. You're going to need to have a button as well as an output area to output the results, because the results are going to be created with JavaScript. Created a file called app2.js. So this is our starting JavaScript file where we're going to create the interaction. So when the user presses roll, it will have a die that's going to update and output the result for the user. So going into the app2.js file, first of all, let's go ahead and we're going to select our page elements. We want to select the button. This is going to be the main interaction point for the user. So just using query selector, I only have the one button element, so just going to select the button element. And then I want to have an output area and selecting the element. So it's going to be selecting the div with a class of results. And that can be used as the output area. We're going to be outputting the HTML results, which is going to be the result for the roll. Let's create a function, and that function, I'm going to call it roller. And this will roll a random number from 1 to, and we can make this more dynamic, but because we're using dice, we want to have a value of 1 to 6. So those are going to be the parameters that we're looking at. So let's go ahead and select creating a random number using the math floor and the math random method in order to generate the random number, multiplying it by a value of 6. So that's going to give us a value of up to 6, and then incrementing it by 1. So we have a value of 1 to 6. So the multiplying by 6 will be 0 to 5 as a result. So this will always return back a random number from 1 to 6. And for now, we can just output that random number into the console, adding in the event listener for the button, add event listener. So whenever the button gets clicked, run the roller function. So let's try out this action. So this is giving us a random number from 1 to 6, and that we can use to add to the character number and then output that into the results area. So for the characters themselves, we're going to create a quick loop. So setting li to 0 and then looping through while I is less than 6 and increment I by 1. And within the output area, we're going to add to the inner HTML and using the HTML character. So that can be output, and HTML characters can be output using the and, the hash symbol, and then the character value. So we're going to be starting at this character value, and I'll just show you what that's going to look like if I simply output it onto the page. So that will output the dice, the 1. I'm also going to update the size of the results using the styling, and this is just regular font characters, so it's really easy to update the size of the font. So this gives us the dice from 1, and it just has the 1 dice. So this is the first starting value for the dice. And if we increment this, so if we change this to 9857, that's going to give us the dice with 2. So we're going to do that where we're going to be incrementing the number, or we can just call this value, and adding to 9856, simply adding in the value of I to that. And I'll update this. Instead of using the quotes, I'll use the backticks. And because this value of val is going to be incrementing dynamically, we can then output that new value of val. So that gives us all of the dice from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So those are all of the possible outputs that we can use. I'll just comment out that just to get rid of that. So that gives us the dice within the results area. So we want to select them randomly. So now we can use the value that's being randomly generated, and instead of adding it as I, we can add it to all of the characters. So I'm going to just comment that one out, copy and paste the code that we were just using, and output the value. We can also add to the value as well, so we can update to the inner HTML, so we can have multiple roles. So every time we roll, we can add a new die value to it. And we're just simply going to be adding the value of the random number. And because we are adding +1, so we can either start out with 55, or we can remove out the +1. So that will generate those random numbers. So let's see what that looks like. So now every time we roll, we're getting a random die from 1 to 6. And then these are just going to be constantly outputting the new dice every time and the new result. You can make it even bigger as well, so that when you roll it. So now let's add in to the gameplay where we can have 2 players and we can have different rolls of the dice, have one value versus another value. So selecting out the roll, we can keep the roll button, but we want to create 2 page for 2 different players to play through the game, and create a game object, and we'll call this players, so the number of players that we want to have. And then as we build the game board, we're going to add to the output area for where we've got the results. So we'll have the message that we want to add to the page, and as well we want to have input and output areas for each one of the players. So let's create a loop for that. And this is just going to be building the game board, or we can create a function to wrap it. I'm going to call it build game. And this is what we're just going to run, and it's going to set up essentially the game board. So let the value of I equal 0, looping through while the value of I is less than the value of game players, and then increment I by 1. So that will give us the 2 players. And we want to add in the 2 players in the output area. And before we do that, let's add in a message area. So within the output, we want to create an object called message. And I want to have this globally available. So I'm actually going to have this on the global level, where we're going to use the document create element. And then using the new element that we created, we're going to append it to the output object. And this will give us a place to interact and provide messages back to the user. You can also try that out where you've got the message. And because this is a new element, we can set the text content as we normally would. And we can say something like hello world. So that will give us the text message area. I'm actually also going to make this smaller, so bring it down to 1 EM. And then we can apply a class for the dice or something like that. And then that can be the 5 EM. So that can be the big one there. So now we've got an area that we can provide a message back to the users. And we're going to use the same format where we're going to add a number of different players into the user area. And this is going to be their elements. So we're going to add those elements into the array, adding it back into the game object so that we can easily reference them when we do the roll for the elements. So let's create the page element. So just as we did where we got the div that we've just created, and this time we're using the game element object, setting the property value to be the element that we're creating. So that's going to be that new object that's contained in there. And then because we've got it identified within the game element, so using the JavaScript array push to the element, or you can do it as a separate object. So you can create the element and then push the object in there, as it's still going to be referencing that same element object. And within that element object, you can set the text content. So right now we're just going to set it to a dash. So that will indicate the new element that's created. and we'll run the function just over here to build the game. And we need to still add the elements to the page. So just as we appended the output of the element, we can also add the new game element, or we can just select it as an element and add it to the page, as it's still going to be referencing the same location. So when we go to roll, so we've got a function called roller, and what we're going to do for this one is this is going to return back the newly built HTML object in the roller. So that will return back the new HTML object, and we'll create a new function called roll dice. And this is where the game will actually be handled. And we'll loop through the number of players, so the same way that we did when we're building the game. So each player can get a roll of the dice. And it's going to return back that random value. And we can also set this up into an object, as we want to be able to track the random number in addition to the HTML object. So let's update this to be an object that's being returned back. And one value for the object will be the HTML, and the other one will be the value of the roll. So that will be contained within the random number. Because once we leave the function, we're not going to have a way to get that random number, or we'll just call it roll value within the random number. So within the console, we're going to run the roller function. And we can also set that into an object, and that can just be the roll player, or we can call it player roll. So it's going to return back the object, and then that new object we can then output into the console, and then afterwards we'll output into the HTML. So there's our two values that are rolled. So they're different, so that time they just occurred to be the same. So it's got the HTML character and then the roll value. And we can use the roll value in order to compare the actual values afterwards. And within the random number, let's just add 1 to it. So it's actually a value that's going to correspond with what we're getting within the roll of the dice that's going to be visible to the user. So as we're rolling the dice, we want to update within the game elements using the value of index. So this will be what the value is for the user and element, and then set the text content of that to the result for the player roll and the HTML. So let's see what that looks like. So those are the two outputs, and we can't use text content because this is HTML. So just set the inner HTML of each one of those elements to be the dice. So there's the dice. Also, let's update this element that we've just created, and using the class list, we're going to add the class of dice, and that will make the font size bigger. And then, of course, you can always customize the font size as well. So it's adding the class of dice as a string value. So there we have the two dice that are rolled. If we increase the number of players, that'll increase the number of rolls that are being output. And then we can also track to see which player has the highest roll. So as we're building the getting the roll of the dice and we're looping through the players, we'll create a variable, and I'll call it tracker. It's actually going to be an array, and the first value will be the winner. So this will be the player number, and right now that'll just be set to null, as we don't have a winner set. And the second value will be the roll value, and that can also be set to 0. And that's actually, let's set this up as an object, so it's easier to read. And so what we want to do is we want to set, and we'll check to see if the current roll value, so that's the roll val that's coming back from the player roll. And you can also console log that into the console, so that before we try to use it, we'll just log it into the console. So that's each one of the players and their rolls, their corresponding rolls. And then you can see them output as the dice on the page. So what we want to do is we want to have a condition that's going to check. So this can just be like the high or something, high value. And then setting that high value. So if the value of tracker high value So using the object, and right now it's set to 0. So if it's actually going to be less than the value of the role value, then we're going to set this to be whatever the role value is. So that way we can always have the highest value. And if we're setting that, then we're also going to set the tracker to winner to be equal to whatever the current value of I is. So those are backticks there. And this is just going to be taking the player and using the template literals, so I plus 1. So we don't have starting at 0. And then once we're finished, we can output the result of tracker. So within the console, we'll output tracker, and that should give us the high role as well as the winner of the role. So the highest role here is player 2, and this player has a value of 5. Let's clear that, and we'll try that again. So again, it's player 2 is the winner, and the value is going to be 6 for player 2. And as we're outputting these values into the console, we can also output the player value. So that will give us an idea of which player rolled what. So player 2 is the winner with a value of 6. And that's going to correspond to what we've got on the page, on the visible page. So this is how you can make a quick dice rolling game with some visible dice and some logic for some simple gameplay. And of course you can add and update the players because this is all dynamic. So we can have 8 players and tracking once again which players have the high value. So in this case, it's only going to be tracking the first one that rolled a 6. It's not going to be tracking the additional ones that roll a 6. So we can also set up an array for the number of winners and have all of them that are matching whatever the high value is. So let's set that as well. And we can check to see if this value is equal. So this should be actually else if. And if these two values are equal, then what we do is we add the player into the array. So we'll update this to be an array. So it'll start out to just be a blank array. And this will give us an array of the winners. And here we just push the player name in there. So that's going to be pushing it into the array. And then we'll also push it into the array, into the winner array. So let's see how that works. And it looks like we've got 3 winners with the high value. And the reason that this isn't working exactly right is because this value actually changed. So we want to make sure that the end result is that we've got all of the players that had rolled the 6. So we still need to make some updates to the script. And the reason this is not working anymore because it's an array, so we actually have to track all of these values because we don't know what the high value is until we've gone through all of the players with the random rolls. So let's create another array and set this to a holder array. And then as we iterate through, we're not going to add in the winner yet. We're going to add these afterwards, but we're going to get the high roll. And then as we get the roll for each one of the players, we're going to add that into the holder array. So just do a push of the object values into the holder array, and then we'll loop through the holder array once we have the highest value, and we're going to make a comparison there, and that will give us a way to select who the winner should be of the round. So going in, and we need to track through who the high value is, and because it's going to be sorted within the players, we don't need to track the player ID numbers, or if we had special names for them, we could do that as well, where we could add that in here. But because we're just using a numeric value, we're going to keep it that we're just pushing it in to get the value, and then we're going to loop through the holder array, and using the index, that will give us a way to return back which player. So going through for each player and index value, and because we're tracking both the index and the player, and that will return back all of the results. And we know that we've got the high value within the tracker high value. So we need to just check to see if the high value is equal to the player, or this should just be player number, but we can call it whatever we want, player score. And if it is, then this is where we would add it into the tracker, the winner. and looping through tracker, and here we just select the index value for the player. So let's try that again. And that gives us the players that rolled the high value, which in this case was 6. So we've got 2 players, 4 and 8. Let's check to see that they're in the winners. So we do have them within the winners. We'll clear that and we'll roll again. So this time the high value was 5, and we just have the one winner there. Did it again, and we just have the high value of 6 there. And you can play through it a number of times just to make sure that everything is working properly. So in this case, once again, we have a high value of 5 because no one rolled a 6, and that's player number 7. So we should have the player number 7. And if there was more than one player that was rolling the 5, we would see that as well within the results here, that the number of players rolled it. So you can try it out as well by adding in a whole bunch of players. So in this case, I've got 18. So got 18 players, and there is actually 5 that rolled a high value of 5. And that was the result that we got there within the rolls. The second time, we've got the high value of 6. So it looked like we've got 6 winners there, and it just lists out all the players with their value of their ID. Let's also go and update the output value. So if you want the value and then also the one that is the winner being output on the screen as well. So we can add that information in as we're looping through. And we've got the number of players at 18, and because it's just going within the order, we can once again use the index values in order to highlight the player object. And we've got all of the elements here within the game element. So let's go ahead and we're going to make another update to the script where we're outputting the roll value. And I'll make this once again smaller. So it'll just be the regular 1EM. And then you can customize this as needed. So this is where we've got the HTML that's being output. I use the backticks in order to customize the output that we've got there, and then just make sure that it works when we do the roll. So there's all of the dice that are being rolled. Do a size there as if we wanted to. So you can customize the output to make the dice bigger. And I'm just going to add in that this is the player number, and then as we're looping through, this is where we've got the value of I. So using the $ and the index value plus 1, so that will give us the player value. So let's see what that looks like. So we've got all of the rolls, and you can also add in the value if you want. So the same way where we've got the player roll, and then as we're selecting out the winners, depending on the index value, we can select the game element using the index value once again. Set the style of the element, and then we can do color. So this will update the font color to be green just for the winners. So they're a lot easier to pick out which ones are the winners. So we've got the 2 winners there, and it's more visually appealing. And then you can also do an else where we can set the ones that didn't win to be like a lighter color or lighter shade. So that can, once again, lets the winners stand out more within the list of all of the players. So there's some of the updates that you can make to the gameplay.